Welcome, I'm Dr. Robert Glatter, medical advisor from Medscape Emergency Medicine. Today we will be discussing a disturbing pattern of non-payment and denials by the insurer Anthem that leaders at the American College of Emergency Physicians, or ACEP, have recently drawn attention to. Here to discuss this is Dr. Andrew Fenton, an emergency physician with Napa Valley Emergency Medical Group, Chief of Staff, Queen of the Valley Medical Center. Also joining us is Jim Blakeman, President of Kirk and Associates, a billing and coding firm, along with Andy Selesnik, a partner with Buckhalter Law Firm in California, specializing in healthcare litigation. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Dr. Fenton, I would like to begin with you. Can you describe the pattern of denials and non-payment that you're currently encountering on high acuity level 5 patients in your emergency medicine group?
So about a year ago, we received a letter from Anthem Blue Cross stating that my group was going to be put into what's called prepayment review program. They sent us a letter and it listed a number of cases that were reportedly going through this program. And it ended with saying that they were going to deny payment on all of these cases that they've reviewed. So we inquired about this and looked into these cases and found out that these were all cases of what we call level 5 charts. So these are the sickest patients, or potentially the sickest patients, who present to the emergency room. So these would be patients with cardiac risk factors and chest pain, who you're worried about heart attacks, and you're worried about possibly blood clot in the lung, and you do extensive testing and sometimes interventions, and these might be trauma patients who had a significant trauma with head injury, potentially intra-abdominal injury. So and all these cases where those people who come to the ER who are potentially quite ill, testing is undertaken and interventions are performed. And these cases were ones that we're happy to report that they didn't have the most devastating or injuries that could maybe be life or potentially limb threatening, but and they were discharged home. So these were being somehow, the algorithm that was being used by Anthem was identifying these higher potentially sick patients that were eventually ruled out for the most serious illnesses and sent home. And these were the ones that they were going to deny. So when we found out about this, we obviously responded and have not heard back really in any meaningful way from Anthem Blue Cross. And we talked to our colleagues and found out that this was actually a program that was being instituted throughout California, both Northern California, Southern California. And we tried to identify a pattern, and they all seem to be these level 5 or the potentially sickest patients who are mostly discharged home. And they also seem to involve groups like that are similar to mine, which is a small independent group. We're not employees of the hospital. We're not part of a large contract managing group, nationwide contract managed group. And so that also seems to be the majority, is that they seem to be focusing on smaller groups and they're focusing on these particular charts. And so a year has passed and we just have not had any sort of satisfactory resolution despite our efforts with regulators, with state leaders, with Anthem Blue Cross. And at this point, it's really impacting our bottom line.
Jim and Andy, I want to bring you into this. First, Jim, what do you think is resulting in non-payment and essentially outright denials, as opposed to just downcoding these charts, these level 5 patients that are presenting in very serious situations?
Activities like Anthem that Dr. Fenton is experiencing have happened all over the country repeatedly, and lawsuits happen, and then the payer cleans up their act and so forth. So in this instance, there are several issues they're addressing, and one, they say those patients just weren't that sick. They didn't deserve a level 5 service. They didn't need one. Whatever you did, even if you coded it as a level 5, we don't think the medical necessity is there. And that's one of the most common reasons for denial these days in an audit like Dr. Fenton's, a prepayment audit. Another is the concept of bundling, where they want to pay one service but not pay others that were performed at the same time. Bundling is simply the fact that when a patient receives 2 different services on the same day, one gets paid and the other doesn't, and the payer says, well, that one is included in the other service. Well, there is something called the surgical concept that in the reimbursement world says some part of some procedures is included in other work. So for instance, a debridement of a of a wound that you're repairing, that debridement might actually be part of the laceration repair. And so you would not bill it separately. You would bill a higher complexity code. But if the debridement happened elsewhere on the body outside the area of complaint, then it would be properly reported. But Anthem in this case wants to bundle both surgical procedures and fractures, and in Dr. Fenton's case, his EKGs and X-rays, and they're doing this around the country. And I've argued for a long time that in many places of the country, even today, you got a better chance of imaging a fracture with a flashlight than getting a radiologist to read a flat film on the weekends. I hope that's not your case, Dr. Fenton. And many ERs have improved their radiology services and gotten radiology on board, and that's all great. It's great for the patient. But when you have to do that alone, those are separately payable services, have been for 35 years. CPT and Medicare says they are not bundled, and yet Anthem says they are.
So, Andy, let me ask you from a legal standpoint. So bundling, maybe you can explain to the audience what that entails and the legality of that and how it relates to these level 5 patients. And also, I want to get into the medical decision-making note, how it relates in the chart ultimately to bundling.
Sure. So the first question with regards to bundling, the payers have never met a claim that they didn't think should have been bundled, right? That you unbundled, that you included services that you shouldn't have. And the providers obviously take a very different view. In emergency medicine, as compared to other disciplines, it's actually quite common and it's part of the coding nomenclature that certain events are coded separately and are payable separately. So like what Jim was talking about and what Andrew's group has experienced is EKG interpretation. The payers say, you provided a basic service, and although you read the EKG in the middle of the night on a Saturday night where the cardiologist was home, comfortably in bed, and you met all the requirements, you put a report into your medical record, they're like, we're not going to pay it, even though it was contemporaneous and led to the treatment, the evaluation treatment of the patient. And so they just don't want to. And because those rates tend to be lower, maybe 40, 50 bucks for the interpretations, they figure they can get away with it. If you look at the payer's view, and Anthem's, is certainly part of a larger group on this particular issue, they all, their business model is predicated on denying portions of claims. That's how they make their money. And while, a lot of people talk about medical loss ratio and they have to spend a certain amount on medical care, that does include cost reserves. And so they're always looking for ways to do this. So sort of segueing to the other part, which is this, the level 5, what we call the level 5 zero pay, Anthem issue. They're the ones who are, who have come up with this as part of a years long, decades long, review of claims, figuring that if they don't pay you, engage in what I call economic extortion, then they, 95% of the people won't do anything, and they'll change their behavior positively for the payers, even though it's probably wrong. And, the other ones they'll fight. And so medical decision making, that's the critical component that they're looking at. They have usually, and I think Jim would agree, they usually have coders who are not experienced in emergency physician coding, which is a particular type of specialty. And they'll say, well, we don't think this was as complicated as the ED doc thought so. And therefore, we're just not going to pay it unless you change the way you code. And so that's the crux of the issue right now, it seems.
Right. But the charts that I reviewed from Dr. Fenton, certainly level 5s look very complex in terms of medical decision-making for high acuity patients. So I'm not sure what the insurers are seeing, and that, these MDMs are very intensely documented. And, we're talking about sick patients, trauma patients, cardiac patients. How are they able to, in other words, look at an MDM that's complex and then issue a complete denial?
It's interesting. I can see what Andy and Jim think, but about this, but I think in the past, they've also been known to look at the final diagnosis, that, you know, that is what they determine whether or not the patient is a level 5 chart. So sometimes the chest pain in the end does get a diagnosis of gastroesophageal reflux disease. So that, you know, to them, they just don't, that's heartburn and they should never present to the ER. So I think they're looking likely at the MDM, but honestly, there's something else they're looking at. Maybe it's the final diagnosis, or maybe again, I think the ultimate thing is just the disposition. Are they sent home or are they admitted? And that's what's falling into that group. And then once they fall into that group via their algorithm, they almost all are denied. They deny nearly every one of them. So it's something sort of spitting out a list, and then I don't think there's a lot of thought or put into it from their behalf. As a matter of fact, we've worked with them on individual charts going over the MDM, and even their own coders agree it's a level 5, but they still deny it.
That's what I discovered when I talked to Dr. Fenton's billing company when they spoke to Anthem. They said it all lines up. It's perfectly documented as a high medical decision. We don't think it merits high MD. We don't think it merits a level 5. Well, there's a way to score these charts. There's rules, and you're saying these meet all the rules, but you just don't like it, so you're not going to pay it. That's a kind of disingenuous work they're doing in the audit process, and that should bring in Andy's response to, hey, you got to cut that out.
We're litigating on behalf of a large number of ED groups in California that are subject to this Anthem policy. But before we litigate, we worked with California ASAP and some of the state legislators and got in a meeting with the Department of Managed Healthcare and Anthem. Anthem wouldn't even go on camera. Their position was, you either code it our way or we're not going to pay. And we're not going to deny, many of the claims too, and so that way the group can't even collect the copay, deductible, or co-insurance. And the regulators, unfortunately, at the DMHC, the Department of Managed Healthcare, which has jurisdiction over some of these claims, essentially punted on the whole thing and is not getting involved. So you leave the emergency physicians in this really difficult position. Ultimately, a large number of them decided they were going to move forward. They had their own, millions and millions of dollars, and so we're currently, fighting with Anthem over it. And as I told their lawyers point blank, I'm very interested to hear what your arguments are, because you're not contending they're not an emergency, but you won't pay them. It'll be interesting to see what you say to the judge. And so we have a hearing in a few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what they say.
So if some of these patients got admitted and weren't discharged, would that change the paradigm here in terms of reimbursement? Is there any thought on that? Jim, I'll start with you.
Well, it does in many cases, but it also does not in many cases too. It's surprising that they just make it up. It's hard to determine a rule that they're following. Dr. Fenton is right. Often it's diagnosis coding, or the diagnosis on the bottom line of the chart. But there is no correlation, direct correlation. They like to deny discharged because, well, if the patient didn't need to go in the hospital, they weren't that sick. But that's never been a component of coding. They know that. But there's some number of admitteds that they deny too. So again, disingenuousness as far as I can read it.
And in terms of the No Surprises Act passed in 20 and currently implemented, and having independent dispute resolution as part of the sort of the approach, has that panned out in any positive way?
I personally think the IDR process is a joke. They don't really require much in the way of expertise for these quote unquote arbitrators. They don't pay them very much to deal with sort of complicated disputes. CMS has set up a process that makes it very hard to group large numbers of claims when you have an egregious payer. They recently came out, I think last week, with some additional requirements that the payers are supposed to tell you if they're down coding and what they would have paid had the code, had they accepted the code. But we already know that there are multiple payers out there who don't follow the NSA, require that you have to submit any disputes through their own proprietary, portal, which is, requires, immense amount of time. And the regulators aren't just really cracking down at all. So I'm I'm not a fan of the IDR NSA process, and if I'm going to take the 50,000 foot level view, I think it impacts every person in the United States. And so far as if the payers who already make lots and lots and lots of money, right, record profits across the board for a long time, they'll continue to make more money, but there'll be less money for emergency medicine. And if there's less money for emergency medicine, that means either the hospitals make it up via subsidy, which to them is a 4-letter word, or there's going to be cuts in staffing, and people's lives are going to be impacted.
Right, and I think you're hitting on the main point now, and I want to bring Dr. Fenton into this because, if hospitals can't, be paid, if physician groups can't be paid, and hospitals are paid, they're paid facility fees. This is just a very serious imbalance that's happening. And I think drawing attention to this from a legislative standpoint, that ASAP's doing, but also elevating this to a higher state level and even to the federal level is really something that has to happen. Dr. Fenton, I'll let you address this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. One thing I would say about just the No Surprises Act is that just if I can go backwards, if they would to pay $1 to us, then we could go into arbitration. But the fact that they pay $0 means it's not subject to the No Surprises Act, and so we can't even arbitrate it. We're just stuck with $0 until the regulators do their job. So yeah, this is it's a major issue, and it's already impacting my group after the pandemic, or not after, we're still during the pandemic, but the height of the pandemic, we had lots of challenges with staffing, and we still have those challenges. And now that we're busy again and people are returning to the ER, and some of them have delayed care, we're having to try to increase our staffing. And our goal is always as soon as a patient is in a room, we're going to have a doctor or a provider in there to see them. There's no wait time, and to meet that, it requires us to be able to have the staff there available, and that's been a real challenge financially, just making ends meet with my small group. We're basically just a small business. If we have one of our largest payers is not paying a dime, I can't staff, and I can't get the supplies we need, and it's going to really be challenging to us locally, and it's going to impact wait times. It's going to impact our local community, and it does need to be elevated to. And I appreciate those whose efforts are on our behalf, and to do that, we've tried to engage our state senator and state assembly person, and they've hopefully taken the ball and are going to take this to the Department of Managed Healthcare and to others to try to highlight what's going on here. And we've spoken to our local congressman. We've talked to our local hospital, and with that, I thought it was interesting. You mentioned the facility fees. So when you come to the ER, and you'll get a charge from the facility, and because we're not employees of the hospital, you often get a physician charge. Physician charge is minuscule compared to the hospital charge. Anyone who's ever gone to an ER, they've seen the bills from the hospital. They're large, and but interestingly, on these same claims that they've denied us, they paid the hospital for the exact same level of acuity. So saying that our charges are unreasonable at that certain coding level is indefensible.
Right. You had mentioned that you are out of network with Anthem, but this is happening to in-network groups as well. So I think that's important to talk about. This is not just limited to that segment.
The entire geography of the state of California is being affected. So it's impacting everyone. We've sat down for years and tried to contract with Anthem, and they've walked away from the table. They really have no incentive to contracting with us because they can just pay us whatever they want, and in this case, they pay us nothing.
Right. So Andy, is there any way to have any class action litigation from multiple groups to approach Anthem? I guess that's what you're doing essentially right now. And how effective will that be, you think, in the long run?
So our action is a direct action, which means we're suing directly. I'm not a fan of the class actions personally in these sorts of areas, because I think the lawyers end up with a lot and the physicians end up with not so much. That's just, again, my personal opinion on it. But we are trying to effectuate change, and we have been successful in other litigation in effectuating change through litigation, because we don't go away, right? The ED and the payers will always have a relationship, and so these issues they just continue to percolate unless you force the payer to make some sort of modification of their policy. So that's one of the things that we're seeking here, is we're seeking that, that exact sort of change in Anthem's policy, which is defend your policy in court or, remove it. And I think that is going to be the challenge for them. They're, obviously they have deep pockets. They have very talented and creative lawyers that I've litigated against for many, many years. But I think this one's a hard one. How do you pay $0 on an admittedly emergency? Admittedly, it's an emergency. It's not a question, was this an emergency or not? As Dr. Fenton was talking about, these are, some of these are very serious. There's no question. How do you pay $0? Because you don't like the way they coded, right? We told them, why don't you just pay something? Pay whatever you think is appropriate on it, and we can fight over that. But they won't do it because they know that this really, really hurts the groups, and so they're remaining stubborn.
This black box that exists in coding really is something that I think needs to change, and I think that's where maybe there has to be some grassroots effort.
That's a great point, Dr. Glatter. There has been, and for many years, coders have complained that the rules are not clear. Payers get to make stuff up. CPT changed the rules in 2021, and it now applies to emergency medicine, or will next year. Those rules are much clearer. It'll be interesting to see the novel approaches that the payers come up with now, because there's a lot more quantification in what's called medical decision making, so that we don't sound like we're just tilting against the wind on these lawsuits. There was a lawsuit in Nevada settled where the courts found, didn't settle, but the courts found in a $60 million award to the physicians because United Healthcare had behaved very badly and very much like what Anthem is doing now. So these do sometimes result in awards. And to Andy's point, even when they don't and they get settled, behavior often has to change. Now, a side note that United Healthcare appears not to have changed their behavior, even though they got hit with a huge penalty. They're still doing the same stuff. So we don't know to what extent. But the fact is that these are worth pursuing, and I appreciate Andy's efforts and all the healthcare attorneys' efforts to defend emergency medicine's rights.
Anthem's had lawsuits and some findings against them too. But I think these penalties that you mentioned, Jim, they have to be put into context of the type of revenues and profits that these health insurers bring in every year. So it really is a slap on the wrist of these, and they've crunched the numbers, and they realize that their payments that they have to pay out and these fines that they have to pay, that in the end they make more money by instituting these programs. If the regulators are going to institute a fine, it really does need to have some teeth if you want to change behavior.
Right. And one question, Andy, I had for you is that, certainly there's state regulation for insurers. What about on a federal level with the Affordable Care Act? Did that in any way implement any kind of watchdog type or oversight for the insurers?
It did not. One of the things obviously is that they had to sort of standardize their payment and the reimbursement. And so I think there were some positives that came out of the Affordable Care Act, including a lot more people being insured, which helps sort of spread the risk. But there's no real national regulatory enforcement scheme. CMS, I think, my numbers might be slightly off, but CMS, I think, thought that their system was going to be so excellent and well received that there would be only, maybe, 20,000 appeals a year nationwide. And I think in the first 6 weeks, they had 40,000 appeals. So they vastly underestimated. I think if they had really listened, instead of the payers, they had listened to the providers and other stakeholders, they would have realized that this system, there are serious issues with the system they set up, and it was going to create a lot of problems and controversies. In fact, they tried to put their thumb, more of like their hand on the scale in favor of payers. So when an arbitrator looks at the amount that the insurance company paid, and the emergency physician is objecting to it, right, and they're in arbitration. Initially, the rules were the arbitrator had to pick the amount the insurance company paid unless there was some sort of extraordinary factor otherwise. The Texas Medical Association, others sued, and a Trump appointee in Texas threw it out and said, that's not consistent with what Congress said. So the department, after much hand wringing, came out with new guidance. I think it was last week, where they said, arbitrators, you should consider the QPA and other factors. And to try to get around this, they ordered the arbitrators to write these opinions that said, if you decide to deviate from the QPA, you have to give all the reasons why. I don't know why they're doing it, but they're not going to change. And the least they could do is force the payers to follow the law in terms of clear notices, right, of what they're paying, clear delineations of downcoding, follow the law in terms of a letter starts the open negotiation process. There's a lot of things they can do. I hope that they do. I'm a skeptic, unfortunately.
I want to thank everyone for shining light on this very complex topic, and certainly solutions to this are, something that we're all looking for. We want patients to be taken care of. We want people to, hospitals to be paid. We want physicians to be paid. There has to be equity here. And, arriving at this is going to take a joint effort. It's going to take compromise. It's going to take oversight. And I think that, this discussion hopefully has enlightened our audience, but there's more to come. Thank you again for everyone and your incredible expertise here.